Connie, for the listening audience, would you just give some of your stats out? Because they're impressive.
Sure. So officially, I am Constantine Aline. I am the founder and president of the Civilian Corrections Academy. I am currently training non-uniformed staff who work in corrections or who want to work in corrections exactly how to engage with that population. I'm also a podcast host of The Fly Behind the Wall, and I am a co-host with Anthony Ganji on Tier Talk, which we do all the time. We talk everything corrections. I'm also a criminal justice professor at Monroe College, so I'm training up the next generation of criminal justice students. And finally, I am an author. I am the author of The Cage Was Her Cocoon, which is really, my journey through corrections, because I started in corrections 20 years ago. And it's like, how really did that happen? So yeah, it did happen.
You left out a very important part.
Yeah.
You were the director of A Safe Horizons.
Yes. So along that journey was 10 years on Rikers Island as a health services manager. And then I went into the domestic violence world, where I was the shelter director for Safe Horizon in New York. And certainly I wouldn't release a location, but that in of itself was one of those experiences that I thought I was strong enough to navigate. And quite frankly, the first woman to come in with she was bruised, she had her children, she had a few garbage bags. And, the first thing I thought was, oh, how do I help? Right? Because you think until you're actually in it, right? Because this woman may not want anyone to touch her. She may not want anyone to jump in and try to take over because she's been controlled long enough, right? And so it really is being able to discern where folks are when they come into shelter and what level of support. And there's a level of patience that you have to have. I think from a systemic perspective, like we just got to get all the information, right? We got to take everything down. But when someone first comes in and they've just had this experience and this is part of their safety plan, the reality is that we've got to allow them to come in, get settled, get their emotions in order, and like really just be a resource of support until they're ready to kind of like, talk about what took place.
I would go to homes and settle a domestic violence call. There would be an injury. The perpetrator would split the scene and run away in typical cowardly fashion. We would take the report and we would make recommendations and then give advice. And then 2 days later, we'd come back and the same person was assaulted again a second time. And we would say, well, why are you back together with him? And the common denominator was he forced his way in the door. He's stronger than me. He pushed his way in. He followed me. And back in the 90s, when I was a cop, there wasn't the cell phones of today. We didn't have the modern technology where you could track people on iPhones and see where their movements are and where the Google Earth and all this. None of that existed. And the thing of it is it still was happening. It was still happening. And I think now with modern technology, it makes it even easier for these narcissistic control freaks to follow and track the movements of their potential victims. And I can't overemphasize the importance of training for law enforcement. And, I may get some crap for this, but I don't care. I feel that the emphasis should be on training the men and women in blue who respond to these calls. And it's going to bring me to my next piece on Gabby Petito. I'm going to play the body cam footage from Moab. Now, this may be triggering to some folks because this resulted in this girl's murder and death. How they handled this should be used as a national standard to train law enforcement how to identify the indicators of a dangerous situation. Now, we don't have a crystal ball. I will say this, that it is a tough situation for any cop to figure out exactly what's happening in an hour time. Now, in Moab, they're not jumping from call to call. So in New York City, we wouldn't have spent that much time with the two of them. They both would have been in handcuffs and been arrested. period, point blank. You could talk to Sergeant Bill Cannon. He's a good friend of mine. He's a supervisor. He worked in the New York City Police Department over 27 years. We both had many conversations about this, and we agree that both would be arrested. It would be cross complaints, and then they would figure it out in court. Now, would that have given time for her to make a phone call to her parents? We don't know. And it's not right to even Monday morning quarterback it. We're talking about a woman, a young girl who lost her life at the hands of her fiance. But that being said, I feel that it is important that we educate and re-educate and retrain and train and retrain for the most current and most effective tools to enforce calls for domestic violence across the slate. And I think we all can agree to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, my situation and just that.
Yeah. I mean, you could talk about this till the sun goes down. There's so many people who could say, I was dissatisfied with what the police did. Now, police have a tough job because here in New York City, I'd have 5 calls waiting, stacked up on top of the call that I'm currently handling. Yeah. Whereas in smaller places like in Utah, there was probably not a backlog or a grid of calls. That's why they were able to sit 4 to 6 officers. I think 2 other park rangers came. So around 4 or 5 officers showed up on the scene. And in New York City, it'd be like the boss would be like, come on, we got to make it, what's going to happen here? Are they both going to go, or what's going to happen? So it's more about liability. And we really can't, on the surface at the scene, make a complete decision on exactly what happened, because you're going to have his side, her side, and then something that's the truth in between.
Why don't I sit you down in backseat of my car? You're not in any trouble, okay? I'm not going to be putting handcuffs on you. You obviously don't have any weapons. I'm going to get you into the air conditioning, let you take a breath, relax a little bit, and then I'll come back and talk to you in a few minutes, okay?
Okay.
All right.
So right away, we see that she completely took blame for the whole entire stop. And I can go on with this and let her continue to tell these 2 officers that it was all because of her wanting to keep the van clean. She was making excuses for Brian's activity. And I'm sure that Kristin, you've seen and heard this in some form or another in your relationship. And I'm sure, Lily, you've seen this happen. Anything jump out at you here? Anybody?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, this is so disturbing. This body cam is so disturbing on so many levels. But let's be clear here. This is not a case. It was not a case of an over anxious young woman with OCD. Yeah. It was such a clear case. The red flags were there from, to your point, Ron, the moment that he even approached them in the van. All of the self-blame, maybe it's my vibe. How about when she said, he doesn't even think I can do any of this? Mm-hmm. And so that's the minimizing. That's, if you can imagine, look, according to the NCADV, occurrences are not, are all of the time. They're never one-off occurrences, according to me, as far as when I coach people and as far as when I speak to my audience. Everyone needs to know that it's never one-off occurrence. I'm sure that Kristin can tell you the same. It's never just one day you woke up and they were in a bad mood. Bullshit. And if you tell yourself that, then you're lying about your own relationship. So you need to understand that. Clearly, she was totally worked up, not from just a road trip. This is, to me, I look at this is someone that has been walking on eggshells for over a year at least. Don't forget, they're coming out of COVID. Right. So their relationship was able to escalate that much faster.
On the last show, Connie and I looked at this and we talked about this, and basically they're in a back of a small little Ford Transit van. Okay. When you have an apartment or a big home where you can have an argument and go, all right, I'm going to this side, I'm going to that side, or I'm leaving and going out. In the middle of nowhere, at nighttime, you can't leave the back of that van if you're having a fight or an argument. You're there. I watched her on her YouTube channel fix a nice dinner with salad and all this stuff, but they were laying on top of it. It was basically, the food was right on top of them. So in this situation, you can't open up the back of the door and go out in the Grand Tetons or go out in the middle of the wilderness and walk it off. You got to just tough it out together. So I think that small enclosed space, the traveling over the road, and a lot of other contributing factors built to it. Connie, I wanted to go to you and ask you, when Brian stays at that safe house, or whatever you want to call it, hotel, where they give that service, what type of counseling is, if any, is given to folks, or what should be given to folks? And let's just say, if not in this case, let's just say we flip the script here and the woman goes to a place like that, a safe haven. What's afforded to them? What should be afforded to them? I mean, I know you can only speak on New York, but I'd like to hear your side of that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, of course, there is sort of the mental and emotional support that they need. So whether it's psychotherapy or it's talk therapy, whichever way people want to refer to it as, I don't feel that everyone needs psychotropic meds. Sometimes you're dealing with a trauma. You need to be able to work through that trauma and be able to talk to someone about what was going on. A lot of times, though, women do need support financially. They need to figure out how they're going to be, because that's usually like, it's the thought of, how am I going to survive this, right? Now that I've taken this step to separate myself, how do I survive this? And you think food, right? You think shelter. How do I take care of my children? And usually that's the economic piece that becomes very burdensome to try to navigate that, while thinking of what are the legal implications that I'm going to have to deal with, and will I be able to afford it, right? And honestly, what you also see is women really wanting to know that their children are going to be safe, right? So what am I going to be able, how am I going to be able to provide for my child, whether it's childcare, whether it's just making sure that they have food. So when they come into shelter, we make sure that they have food. We make sure that if they need medical services, we have them connected to medical services. If it's legal services, we connect them to legal services. We connect them to mental health services, you name it. We try to make sure that we sort of wrap them with all of those services in the moment, especially just to help them become stable. And for each person, it may take, it's a different time frame, right? It may take longer for one than it might take for someone else, right? And for different reasons, which I think that's something that we have to be mindful of. Many times they're going through these situations for so long that it may take a very long time to provide them with the necessary support so that they can be stable or self-sustaining.